It is not impenetrable. What happened proves that. And the proof is not coming from Iranian state media. The proof is coming from Israeli hospitals, from Israeli emergency services, from satellite imagery being analyzed right now by defense analysts in Washington, London, and Tel Aviv itself. The proof is coming from the silence of officials who, 24 hours ago, were assuring their populations that the Iron Dome, the David Sling, and the Arrow systems represented an absolute shield. Shields, as history has repeatedly demonstrated, are only as strong as the assumptions behind them. And last night, the assumptions failed. I want you to stay with me for the next 20 minutes, because what I am going to walk you through is not simply a military story. It is not simply a story about missiles and interceptors and kill ratios. It is a story about a strategic miscalculation that has been building for years, about a doctrine that was sold to the Israeli public and to the American taxpayer as foolproof, and about what happens when a nation discovers, in the most brutal way possible, that the system it trusted with its survival has a ceiling and that its adversary just found it. Before we get into what happened, you need to understand the geography and the architecture of what Israel spent decades and billions of dollars building, because without that context, you cannot understand the magnitude of what occurred. Israel's layered missile defense system is, on paper, one of the most sophisticated ever constructed. The Iron Dome is designed to intercept short-range rockets and artillery shells at ranges of 4 to 70 kilometers. David Sling handles medium to long-range ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. The Arrow system Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 is designed to intercept ballistic missiles at exo-atmospheric altitudes, meaning outside the Earth's atmosphere, before they re-enter and approach their targets. Each layer is designed to catch what the layer above it misses. The entire system has been developed over 30 years in partnership with the United States. The development cost alone exceeds $10 billion. Annual operational costs run into the hundreds of millions. The United States Congress has funded significant portions of this system as part of American defense commitments to Israel. This is not a cheap system. This is not an improvised system. This is the most expensive, most technically advanced, most thoroughly tested missile defense architecture outside of the continental United States itself. And according to every official statement made before last night, it worked. Israeli defense officials cited Iron Dome interception rates of 90% or higher against Hamas rocket fire from Gaza. American military spokespeople pointed to the system as a model for future Allied defense architecture. Defense contractors cited Israeli missile defense in every pitch they made to governments in the Gulf, in Eastern Europe, in Asia. Subscribe now if you are watching this and realizing that the story you are about to hear has not been told this way anywhere else. Because the question nobody is answering, the question every defense analyst in the world is asking this morning, is simple. If the system is 90% effective, and Iran fired approximately 2,000 missiles and drones in a single coordinated salvo, then what does 10% mean? What does it mean when the number getting through is not a handful of rockets from Gaza, but 200 projectiles or more reaching Israeli territory? Announcement number 1, the saturation doctrine. And this one matters more than any technical specification, more than any individual missile system, because it is the strategic logic that Iran has been developing quietly and methodically for over a decade, and it is the reason last night happened the way it did. Iran did not fire 2,000 missiles because it had 2,000 missiles to spare. Iran fired 2,000 missiles because Iranian military planners understood something that Western defense analysts have been reluctant to say publicly. Every missile defense system in existence has a saturation threshold. There is a specific, calculable number of simultaneous incoming projectiles beyond which any defense system, regardless of its sophistication, regardless of its interception rate, begins to fail. Not because the technology stops working, because the technology runs out of interceptors, runs out of processing bandwidth, runs out of the physical capacity to engage every threat simultaneously. This is not a secret. American military theorists have written about saturation attacks in academic journals for 20 years. The RAND Corporation published analysis on layered defense saturation vulnerabilities as far back as 2015. What is remarkable is not that Iran understood this. What is remarkable is that Western governments allowed their publics, and arguably themselves, to believe that the saturation problem had been solved. It had not been solved. It had been managed, and management is not the same thing as solution. According to reporting confirmed by multiple Western defense analysts in the hours following the attack, Iranian forces coordinated what military planners call a multi-vector, multi-domain salvo, meaning the missiles and drones came not from a single direction, not from a single category of weapon, but from multiple directions simultaneously, using ballistic trajectories, cruise trajectories, and drone swarms operating at different altitudes and at different speeds. This is not random, this is deliberate. When you force a layered defense system to engage threats coming from multiple vectors at multiple altitudes simultaneously, you do not simply stress it, you fragment it. You force each layer to manage more simultaneous engagements than it was designed to handle, and you create gaps between the layers. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's analysis of Iranian missile inventory, published in early 2025, Iran maintains an arsenal of ballistic missiles ranging from the Shahab series to the Fateh hypersonic missile, supplemented by Shahed series drones that have already demonstrated their ability to penetrate European air defense systems over Ukraine. Iran did not use all of these weapons last night. It used a calculated combination designed not to overwhelm any one layer, but to overwhelm the system as a system. Announcement number 2, the interception mathematics that nobody wants to discuss publicly. And this is the part that the American defense establishment has confirmed, whether or not it intends to say so explicitly. Iron Dome, when functioning against the threat it was designed for short-range unguided rockets from Gaza, achieves interception rates that are genuinely impressive. But Iron Dome uses Tamir interceptor missiles. Each Tamir interceptor costs approximately $50,000. When you fire 2 interceptors per incoming threat, which is the standard practice to ensure interception, you are spending $100,000 per rocket intercepted. Against Hamas rockets that cost perhaps $300 each, this economics is painful but manageable. Against a salvo of 2,000 Iranian missiles that cost on average between $500,000 and $1.5 million each, depending on type, the mathematics become something entirely different. Stay with me here because this is where the analysis becomes impossible to ignore. Israel's Iron Dome system operates with a finite interceptor magazine. The exact number is classified, but independent analyses by the Missile Defense Advocacy Alliance and by Jane's Defense Weekly have estimated that the total available Tamir interceptor inventory across all active Iron Dome batteries in Israel at any given time is in the range of 1,000 to 2,000 missiles. David Sling and Arrow systems maintain their own separate interceptor stocks, also finite, also classified, also estimated in the hundreds rather than thousands. When Iran fires 2,000 projectiles, you are not facing a situation where you have surplus capacity. You are facing a situation where your interceptor inventory and your incoming threat number are approaching parity. And when they approach parity, and when your interceptors begin to deplete faster than they can be replaced, because Tamir missiles take time to manufacture, and time to ship, and time to load the system, begins to experience what defense engineers call magazine exhaustion. Batteries that have fired all their interceptors become inert. They exist. They are physical structures. But they cannot intercept anything until they are reloaded, and reloading in the middle of an active attack is not operationally possible. The New York Times reported in 2024 that Iron Dome battery reloading requires ground crews and takes a minimum of several hours under optimal conditions. Several hours is not a number that matters during a single night attack. What matters during a single night attack is what is loaded when the salvo begins. Announcement number 2 is this. Israel faced a magazine exhaustion problem last night, not a technology failure, not a system malfunction, a capacity problem that was, in the most precise sense of the word, predictable. Iranian planners predicted it. That is why they chose the number they chose. Announcement number 3, and this one almost nobody in the Western mainstream media is connecting correctly. The Iron Dome failure last night is not just a military event. It is the end of a deterrence architecture that has shaped Middle Eastern geopolitics for 30 years. Here is what I mean. Israel's entire strategic posture in the region rests on 2 pillars. The first pillar is the credibility of its offensive capability, the ability to strike any target in the region with precision and consequence. The second pillar, equally important, is the perceived invulnerability of the Israeli home front. The belief, cultivated over decades and reinforced by every statement from Israeli and American officials, that Israel's civilian population could be protected from missile attack by a technological shield that made large-scale attacks against Israeli cities effectively futile. If that second pillar holds, Israel can manage escalation from a position of security. It can conduct military operations in Gaza, in Lebanon, against Iranian proxies, knowing that the home front is protected. If that second pillar fails, if it is demonstrated publicly, undeniably, in a single night, that 2,000 missiles can break through Israeli defenses and reach Israeli cities, then the entire strategic calculus changes. Because deterrence is not about what your weapons can do, deterrence is about what your adversary believes your weapons can do. And what Iran demonstrated last night is something that no amount of official reassurance will easily walk back, that the shield has a ceiling and that Iran has found it. According to analysis published by the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies at Bar-Ilan University in 2024, Israel's deterrence credibility depends critically on the perception of home front invulnerability. The study noted that any successful large-scale penetration of Israeli air defenses would constitute a fundamental strategic shock requiring complete reassessment of Israeli defense doctrine. That reassessment is happening right now. This morning, in rooms in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Washington that we are not invited into, but whose conclusions will shape every event in this region for the next decade. Now let us talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are two stories playing out simultaneously, and the Western media is covering only one of them. The story being covered is the military story, the missile counts, the damage assessments, the political statements, the emergency sessions of the United Nations Security Council. These things are real and they matter, but they are the surface of the water. What is beneath the surface is a strategic story about how we arrived here, and more importantly, what comes next. The mainstream narrative, the one being repeated across every Western news network this morning, goes approximately like this. Iran launched an unprecedented and unprovoked attack. Israel's defenses performed admirably under extreme circumstances. The United States stands fully behind Israel, and the international community is calling for restraint. This narrative is not fabricated from nothing. It contains elements of truth, but it contains a structural omission that changes everything. The structural omission is this. Last night did not happen in a vacuum. It happened at the end of a chain of escalatory actions and decisions that stretch back months, and that chain includes decisions made in Tel Aviv that were not minor. The Israeli strikes on Iranian military infrastructure, the Israeli operations in Syria targeting Iranian advisors, the strikes on Iranian-linked facilities that Iran had explicitly and publicly warned would generate a response. These are not background noise. They are the direct causal context for what happened last night. Benjamin Netanyahu's government responded to Iran's warnings by characterizing them as bluster. Unnamed Israeli officials told Western journalists, as recently as 3 weeks ago, that Iran was deterred, that the Islamic Republic understood the consequences of direct confrontation, that the axis of resistance was weakening. These assessments, communicated confidently to journalists who repeated them to millions of readers and viewers, have not notably changed the outcome of last night. Think carefully about what this represents. When a government publicly and repeatedly assures its population that its adversary is deterred and incapable of effective escalation, and then that adversary launches the largest missile attack in the history of the modern Middle East, that is not an intelligence failure in the conventional sense. Intelligence failures involve missing information. This is something different. This is a failure of strategic imagination, the inability or unwillingness to take seriously the stated intentions and demonstrated capabilities of an adversary because doing so was politically inconvenient. The cost of that political inconvenience is now being counted in destroyed infrastructure, in Israeli hospitals operating under emergency protocols, in a population that spent a night in shelters and emerged to discover that the shield they were promised is not what they were told. And there is a dimension of this story that affects every person watching right now, regardless of where you live. The energy markets opened this morning with oil prices moving sharply. Brent crude and West Texas Intermediate both registered significant upward movement in overnight trading, reflecting what commodity analysts are calling a genuine Middle East risk. Premium, the market's calculation that the possibility of sustained conflict disrupting Persian Gulf energy flows is no longer theoretical. If you drive a car, if you heat your home, if you purchase any product that is manufactured or transported using petroleum-derived energy, this is not a foreign policy story for you. It is a household economics story. In 480 BC, at the pass of Thermopylae, the Persian Empire under Xerxes encountered a Greek defensive force holding terrain that should have been impenetrable. The pass was narrow, the Greeks were disciplined, the defensive position was nearly perfect. Persian numbers were overwhelming, but numbers alone could not exploit a position that geography made narrow enough to neutralize the Persian numerical advantage. The defense held until a local shepherd revealed a mountain path that bypassed the pass entirely. The Persians did not defeat the Greek defense at Thermopylae, they rendered it irrelevant by finding the path around it. Iran did not defeat the Iron Dome last night in the sense of destroying it. The batteries still exist, the technology still functions. What Iran did was find the path around it, not a geographic path, but a mathematical one. The path of saturation. The path that says a defense system with finite capacity can be rendered irrelevant not by defeating it, but by exceeding it. The Greek commanders at Thermopylae believed their position was impregnable until the moment it was not. Israeli and American defense planners believed their layered architecture was sufficient until last night demonstrated that sufficiency is always relative to the scale of the attack it faces. The lesson of Thermopylae is not that defense is futile. The lesson is that no defensive position is impregnable against an adversary willing to find and exploit its specific vulnerabilities. The lesson is that confidence in a defensive position, when that confidence becomes absolute, creates exactly the complacency that adversaries are looking for. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 clear paths forward, because there is no honest middle ground in an analysis of what comes next, and I want to be specific rather than vague, because specificity is the only thing that will actually help you understand what you are watching unfold. Path 1 is the managed escalation scenario. In this scenario, Israeli and American officials conduct emergency consultations, agree that a massive retaliatory strike against Iran carries risks of regional conflagration that neither party currently wants to manage, and choose a calibrated military response strikes against specific Iranian military targets, probably missile production facilities or Revolutionary Guard infrastructure, designed to signal resolve without triggering a further escalation cycle. In parallel, diplomatic channels through Qatar, through Oman, through back channels that both sides maintain, regardless of public posturing, begin working toward a de-escalation understanding. This path requires political will on both sides and a mutual calculation that the costs of continued escalation exceed the costs of stepping back. It is possible. It has happened before in this conflict's history. Path 2 is the full escalation scenario, and this is the path that keeps defense analysts awake. In this scenario, the Israeli government, facing a domestic population that has just spent a night in shelters and emerged to discover significant damage and casualties, faces irresistible domestic political pressure to respond in a manner proportionate to what it just experienced. A proportionate response to 2,000 missiles is not a surgical strike on a missile factory. A proportionate response, in the logic of deterrence restoration, is a strike campaign of comparable scale. That means strikes on Iranian territory, not Iranian proxies, not Iranian-linked facilities in Syria or Lebanon, but Iranian territory. The Islamic Republic has stated repeatedly and consistently that strikes on Iranian territory would be met with responses exceeding anything Iran has previously executed. If Path 2 is the path taken, we are looking at a regional conflict whose scope and duration cannot be predicted with any confidence. Path 3 is the slow burn scenario, the one I think is being underweighted in most current analysis. In this scenario, neither side moves immediately to large-scale retaliation. But the strategic landscape has shifted so fundamentally that the pre-last night equilibrium cannot be restored. Israel begins an extended and expensive effort to rebuild interceptor stocks and expand defense capacity, knowing that Iran has demonstrated the ability to saturate its current architecture. Iran, having demonstrated that ability, uses it as leverage not necessarily by launching another attack, but by holding the credible threat of another attack over every Israeli and American strategic calculation in the region. The conflict does not escalate into open war. It freezes into a new and deeply unstable form of deterrence, one based not on the invulnerability of the Israeli home front, but on the mutual recognition that the next escalation could be worse than the last. This is, historically, one of the most dangerous forms of strategic stability, because it is stability built on fear rather than security, and fear has a tendency to generate the very conflicts it is meant to prevent. I think we are closer to a combination of paths 1 and 3 than the headlines suggest this morning. The political pressures pushing toward path 2 are real, but the American calculation and the American restraint, or lack thereof, is the variable that matters most here, is likely to push hard against full escalation. Washington has its own interests in this region, its own relationships with Gulf states that become extremely complicated in a full regional war, and its own domestic political considerations. But, and this is the caveat that matters, American restraint is not guaranteed, and the specific individuals currently making these decisions have not always prioritized de-escalation when other pressures were present. Here are the questions I want you to take away from this analysis. The first, can Israel restore credible deterrence without a response that risks full regional war? And if so, how? The second, does the demonstration of Iron Dome's saturation threshold change the military calculus of every other actor in the region? Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, who now has empirical evidence of what 2,000 missiles achieves? And the third, the one I believe matters most in the long run, does last night accelerate or decelerate the timeline for a negotiated settlement to the broader Iran-Israel conflict, given that both sides have now demonstrated capabilities that make continued escalation genuinely dangerous to both? Tell me in the comments which path you believe is most likely. Tell me whether you think the American response in the next 72 hours will push this toward de-escalation or deeper conflict. We will be tracking every development as it emerges: the diplomatic signals, the military movements, the energy market indicators, the statements from Moscow and Beijing, whose positions matter enormously in what comes next. Subscribe now if this level of analysis is what you need to actually understand what is happening in the world. Share this with everyone in your network who is trying to make sense of what they are seeing on their news feeds. Turn on notifications because the next 72 hours are going to move quickly, and when they do, we will be here with the analysis that goes past the headlines, past the official statements, and into what is actually being decided.